The summer of 1898 gilds Newport in light, but beneath the glitter, something fractures. Emily Fairfax arrives as a paid companion, poised, invisible, and determined to keep her silence. At a grand musicale, the most feared magnate in America looks at her as no one ever has. That same night, a private ledger vanishes. Names, donations, power. A secret is about to surface, and a past she buried threatens to rise with the tide. Between duty and desire, reputation and truth, one impossible choice will decide everything. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about period romances, the scandal, the slow burn longing, or the triumph of a hard-won love? Newport, Rhode Island, the summer of 1898. The sea air was thick with the scent of salt and secrets, and the opulent facades of Bellevue Avenue glistened beneath the golden haze of late June. Gilded spires caught the morning light like coronets on the heads of great stone queens, and carriages rattled over oyster-shell lanes toward the next grand affair. It was a season designed for spectacle and whispers, when society's daughters danced on the edge of inheritance, and its women, if they dared age, faded like wallpaper behind lace-curtained parlours. Emily Fairfax, seated beside the young woman she once tutored, crossed her gloved hands atop a pale lilac skirt and listened as Beatrice Langley recited her itinerary for the afternoon. Fittings, florists, and a luncheon where senators' wives would murmur about corset lines and connections. Beatrice spoke with the bright, breathless certainty of the very young, though her sapphire eyes were rimmed with unease. Her voice floated like perfume in the carriage, but Emily's attention rested on the spaces between words, the falter in Beatrice's breath, the stiffness in her fingers as she adjusted her lace gloves. At 40, Emily knew how to observe without seeming to do so. Her life had been spent in rooms where she was present but unacknowledged, a shadow behind debutante silk, a listener between polished mirrors. She had been a governess, a translator, a secretary. Now she was a companion, an elegant title for a woman whose value resided in restraint. Her gowns were modest, always pressed, and smelled faintly of lavender and starch. Her hair, parted with precision, bore the silver strands she refused to hide. And yet, beneath the discipline, there remained a flicker of warmth in her hazel eyes, a gentle gravity that steadied any room she entered. That morning the Langley mansion stirred with the activity of impending presentation. Footmen passed with trays of bone china teacups, and a French seamstress wept silently over a misplaced panel of Valenciennes lace. In the drawing room, where marble floors gleamed and portraits of Langley's past stared with cold authority, Emily stood behind Beatrice's chair as the girl was coiffed and powdered, her youth polished into marketable elegance. "Is it true he'll be there tonight?" Beatrice asked in a murmur, as if the question itself were contraband. Emily lifted her gaze to the mirror. "If you mean Mr. Keaton, I believe so." Bramwell Keaton. The name was spoken in Newport like a storm warning, low and loaded with tension. He was a widower and a titan, a man whose ships charted the coasts from Havana to Halifax. Rumors claimed he had ruined men with the flick of a pen, buried enemies beneath maritime contracts, and carried his sorrow like an anchor sewn into his chest. He had not danced since his wife's death 6 years prior, nor had he ever stayed in Newport longer than 3 days. And yet, this season, he had arrived with no stated reason and taken rooms not far from the Langley estate. That evening, the Astor Musicale bloomed like a greenhouse of whispered ambition. The ballroom, a cavern of mirrors and gold-leaf panels, was filled with chandeliers that cast hundreds of glittering stars upon corseted guests. The musicians played selections from Faust, while debutantes paraded in gowns of sherbet silk and lorgnettes fluttered like fans of judgment. Emily, though technically seated in the corner near the potted palms, was not invisible. She felt the eyes that drifted her way, measuring the seams of her dove-grey dress, the elegance of her posture, the mystery of a woman without a ring or a fortune who nonetheless carried herself like a duchess in exile. She was watching the stage when she felt it, the unmistakable shift in air, as if someone had opened a window inside her chest. Across the room, Bramwell Keaton stood near a marble column, his dark grey suit tailored like armour, his expression unreadable. His eyes, steel blue and unwavering, were fixed not on the performers, but on her. Emily did not look away. For a moment, suspended between one measure and the next, there was no orchestra, no glittering ceiling, no expectations. Only the gaze of a man unaccustomed to softness, and a woman who had grown used to being unseen. It was not a romantic gaze, nor a hungry one. It was simply this: he saw her. Then the music resumed, and he turned to speak with an alderman, his mouth bending into something close to a smile. Emily exhaled, unaware she'd been holding her breath. Later that night, the Langley household rustled with the sounds of disrobing and whispered scandal. Beatrice's maid could not find the ledger she had placed on the escritoire, an ivory-bound book where Beatrice kept her guest lists, charitable pledges, and notes dictated by her fiancé's mother. Emily, summoned quietly by Mrs. Alcott, reviewed the room with calm precision. No drawers were forced, no paper scattered, and yet the ledger was gone. "Did anyone else come into the room?" Emily asked gently. The maid shook her head, but her eyes darted toward the hallway, toward the wing where Rupert Langley, the ever-smiling cousin with polished boots and borrowed time, had been seen last. Emily said nothing. She simply nodded, then walked to the window and looked out toward the gardens where the moonlight fell like silver lace over the hedges. The ocean beyond whispered its age-old warning. Secrets sink, but some, if timed just so, rise with the tide. In the quiet of her own room that night, Emily unpinned her hair and stared at her reflection in the vanity mirror. For the first time in years, her thoughts were not occupied by duty or decorum, but by a glance, a ledger, and a name that made society flinch: Bramwell Keaton. And in the echo of that name, something in her chest, a thing long buried under years of silence, stirred. Morning came slowly to Newport, as if even the sun hesitated to rise, where society reigned with such ferocity. The Langley estate, perched at the edge of an immaculate lawn sloping toward the sea, stood in its usual silence, save for the occasional murmur of servants and the rustle of a lace curtain caught in the breeze. Yet within its grand halls, unease had begun to take root, like ivy on stone. Emily Fairfax stood at the far end of the library, her gloved fingers tracing the embossed title of a leather-bound volume. The hush of the room, usually her refuge, now felt heavier than usual. Somewhere in the upper floors, Beatrice rehearsed music for her engagement recital, the delicate notes drifting downward like falling petals. The melody was sweet, but Emily could not hear it without hearing, too, the soft panic in Beatrice's voice from the night before. The ledger remained missing. No mention of it had been made at breakfast. The Langley patriarch had departed early for a private meeting at the Union Club, and Beatrice's mother had declared herself unwell, retiring to her rooms with a lace handkerchief pressed dramatically to her brow. Rupert, of course, had been all confidence and charm, offering Emily a bow too deep for propriety and a smile too polished for sincerity. "I trust you slept soundly," he had said, lifting a porcelain cup of chocolate to his lips. "Our little house does have a tendency to hum with secrets." He had not said your secrets nor ours, but Emily had felt the implication as clearly as if he had placed it on the silver tray beside the toast. Now, alone in the library, she allowed herself the smallest frown. She knew men like Rupert Langley. She had known them in parlours and on balconies, at garden parties and funerals. Men who turned conversation into a game of knives, who could wound with a question and disarm with a grin. His gaze lingered too long on Beatrice, too intently on Emily herself, as if he suspected something useful might be pulled from either woman if only he pressed in the right place. "Secrets," she murmured aloud, returning the book to the shelf. "Indeed, most libraries have a few." The voice came from behind her, deep, measured, and unhurried. Emily turned. Bramwell Keaton stood just inside the threshold of the room, the late morning light from the tall windows catching on the silver at his temples and the polished handle of the cane he held, more as accessory than aid. He was dressed in a charcoal grey suit, with a crisp white collar, every detail precise, as though he had been constructed rather than born. Yet what struck Emily most was the stillness in his posture, as if he existed in a different tempo than the rest of the world. "Mr. Keaton," she said, recovering quickly, "I did not hear you enter." "Most people don't," he replied, then offered a faint smile. "It's a habit I've found useful." She nodded, unsure if he referred to boardrooms or ballrooms. "I was told you enjoyed Tennyson," he continued, stepping into the room. Her heart stuttered. "I do, though I sometimes prefer Rossetti. Less grandeur, more ache." "Ache," he repeated, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to suggest amusement. A useful word. Emily folded her hands before her, more aware of her posture than she had been a moment earlier. "Were you seeking someone, Mr. Keaton?" "I was told Miss Langley's companion was versed in poetry and discretion. I came to see if that was true." There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet observation, as if he were examining not just her words, but the spaces between them. "I do my best," she answered. He moved closer to the shelves, his eyes scanning the rows. "Do you know what I dislike most about society's events, Miss Fairfax?" "No," she said, her voice soft, "but I imagine you're about to tell me." He chuckled low in his throat. "They mistake performance for presence, noise for meaning." Emily allowed herself a breath of silence before answering. "And yet you attend them." "I own ships," he replied, "not illusions, but sometimes they are one and the same." The room felt smaller suddenly. Or perhaps it was just the gravity of his presence, a man shaped by storms and steel, speaking in riddles that revealed more than they concealed. And yet, beneath it, Emily sensed something else. Not arrogance, not superiority. Grief, perhaps, or weariness. "I remember your recitation last night," he said, glancing at her sidelong. "You quoted Keats, but you misremembered the line." She lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance but in awareness. "Did I? It's a thing of beauty is a joy forever. You said for always, a small difference but a significant one." Emily's lips curved faintly. "Perhaps I preferred the softness of always." He considered this, then nodded. "As do I." For a long moment they stood in silence, not awkward but charged. A current passed between them, not overt, not improper, but undeniable. It lingered in the air like the scent of lilacs after rain. Then footsteps echoed down the corridor, and the spell broke. Keaton turned slightly. "I won't take more of your time, Miss Fairfax, but I am glad we spoke." She bowed her head. "As am I." And then he was gone, leaving only the echo of his voice and the scent of his cologne, oak and bergamot, and something else, something like distance. Later that day, as Emily joined Beatrice for a reading in the West Parlour, she noticed the change. Rupert sat beside the pianoforte, his fingers tapping lightly against his thigh. His smile was sharp, his voice lilting with a touch too much charm. "I hear Mr. Keaton has taken quite an interest in the household," he said casually, sipping his cordial. Beatrice glanced up, puzzled. "He only came by briefly." "Oh, I'm sure," Rupert said, his eyes flicking to Emily. "Though I do find it curious that a man of his reputation would trouble himself over poetry." Emily met his gaze squarely. "Some men are capable of more than they appear." Rupert's smile faltered for half a breath, then returned with even more sweetness. "Indeed, but appearances, Miss Fairfax, are often the only things society bothers to remember." That night, Emily sat alone in her small chamber, penning a letter she would never send. The words came slowly, shaped by memory and silence. There is a kind of man whose presence disturbs the air around him, not through force, but through focus. He does not need to speak loudly. He only needs to see you. And when he does, It is as if the rest of the world no longer matters. She set the pen down and pressed her fingers against the ink-stained paper. In the distance, waves struck the rocks with steady rhythm. Outside her window, the world danced with privilege and pretense, but inside her something had shifted, something that would not be unwritten. The first breath of dawn arrived like a secret across the lawns of the Langley estate, draping the manicured hedges and marble balustrades in soft golden light. From her window on the third floor, Emily Fairfax watched the mist slowly lift from the garden's labyrinth paths. A robin settled on the branch just outside the glass, puffing its feathers as if to guard the silence of the morning. She had not slept. Not truly. Not with so many currents pulling beneath the surface of her calm expression. There were things unsaid, things Rupert Langley had implied, things Beatrice had not dared confess, and a gaze exchanged in the library that lingered in her chest like a question unanswered. Emily rose and dressed with habitual precision. Her gown was a soft shade of ash blue, high-collared and neatly fastened with mother-of-pearl buttons. She pulled her chestnut hair into a smooth chignon, leaving a few strands softened by the humidity of the summer air. Every detail, from the polished walking boots to the linen gloves folded neatly in her hand, was composed. It had to be. As she made her way to the breakfast room, Mrs. Alcott intercepted her in the hallway. The older woman's face, usually so composed, was drawn with worry beneath her lace-edged cap. "Miss Fairfax," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "May I speak with you a moment?" Emily nodded, and they slipped into the service corridor, where the smell of baked bread and fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen beyond. "I won't waste your time," Mrs. Alcott said, her voice low. "I've overheard Mr. Rupert speaking to the footman. He's planting things, miss. Lies, questions, about where you come from, about who you really are." Emily's heart remained steady, but her breath shallowed. "What sort of things?" she asked quietly. "That you've used influence before," Mrs. Alcott said grimly. "That you were dismissed in London for meddling in family affairs that weren't yours. He's clever, miss. He doesn't accuse. He suggests. And you know how quickly a suggestion grows teeth in a house like this." Emily's mouth was dry, and Beatrice, "She doesn't know," the housekeeper said. "But I fear he means to use her too. And I've seen the way you look after that girl. You'd take the blow yourself before you let him do harm. Which is why I had to tell you." Emily's eyes met hers. "Thank you, Mrs. Alcott. I don't forget loyalty, nor kindness." Before another word could pass between them, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the opposite hall. A footman appeared with a note upon a silver tray, his expression carefully neutral. "For you, miss." Emily unfolded the parchment. "Miss Fairfax, if your morning is not yet engaged, I invite you to join me for breakfast on the East Terrace at 8:30. There is a matter I wish to discuss, discreetly. Bramwell Keaton." The words were simple, the implication anything but. She nodded to the footman, tucked the letter into her glove, and turned down the corridor, her pace calm, though her thoughts surged like the tides. By the time she arrived at the East Terrace, the sun had fully breached the horizon. The harbour glittered below, like a tray of scattered diamonds, ships anchored in silent majesty as gulls circled overhead. A linen-covered table had been set near the balustrade, shaded by a striped parasol, 2 chairs, 2 cups, a silver pot of steaming tea, and Bramwell Keaton. He stood as she approached, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the pale stone. His coat was a deep navy today, simple but cut to perfection. He did not wear a boutonniere. There were no adornments, only the gold chain of a pocket watch and the gravity in his eyes. "Miss Fairfax," he said, offering a small incline of his head. "Mr. Keaton." She took the seat he indicated, folding her gloves with deliberate care. "I admit I am curious." "As am I," he replied, pouring her a cup of tea, "though my reasons are less mysterious than they may appear." He did not sit immediately, but turned his gaze toward the harbour, as if the words he sought lived somewhere beyond the sails and salt air. "You know Miss Langley well," he said at last. Emily studied his profile. Strong jaw, the line of grief settled between his brow, the curve of his mouth restrained even in rest. "I was her governess when she was 12, Emily answered. "Her mother dismissed me 3 years later, but Beatrice and I have remained familiar. And she listens to you." "I hope so." Bramwell nodded slowly and finally sat. He laced his fingers before him on the table and studied her without intrusion. She seems unsettled, tense. Her smiles are rehearsed. Her silences louder than they should be. I have witnessed enough political marriages to know the signs. Emily exhaled slowly. She does not want to disappoint her family, nor to be traded like a bond for political favor. His eyes met hers. "And what do you want, Miss Fairfax?" The question caught her off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "You protect her, fiercely. That sort of loyalty is not born from employment alone. It's forged in the fire of experience." Her hands remained still on the linen. "I was once accused of overstepping my station, of knowing too much. In London, I lost my post defending the dignity of another young woman, one who could not speak for herself. I told myself I would never intervene again." He tilted his head. But Beatrice is not just a young woman. She is a girl I once read poetry to when she was too afraid to speak in front of her father. She is a girl who hides her tears in the folds of curtain silk. She is a young lady, yes, but not yet a woman, not enough to see all that Rupert Langley hides behind his teeth. Keaton leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what do you see behind them?" "Debt," she replied. "Desperation, and a hunger that has nothing to do with affection." Silence followed, not empty but charged. He nodded once. "There is something you should know," he said quietly. "I fund a charity in Newport," quietly, "for the widows of dock workers and sailors lost at sea. Children too. They live in places the society pages never mention, but they live because someone remembers them." Emily's throat tightened. "Why the secrecy?" "Because I am tired of being praised only when it suits others, and because grief is not something I wish to advertise." He looked at her then, not with intensity, but with understanding. "My wife died in Naples. It was cholera. She was 34. She liked rainstorms and green carnations. And I have not spoken her name aloud in 3 years. Emily did not move, did not speak. "You do not need to pity me," he continued. "I say this not to soften you, but to explain why I noticed you." At that, her gaze lifted. "I've watched you, Miss Fairfax, not out of suspicion, out of recognition. You carry silence the way some wear jewels, but yours shines in a different light." The breeze stirred between them. On the table, the edge of a napkin fluttered like a heart. "I believe we may be of use to each other," he said at last. "Not in any improper way, but as allies. You see what others ignore. I have the means to protect what matters. Let us use both." Emily's voice was steady. "And what would this alliance require?" "Discretion, honesty, nothing more, nothing less." She studied him a long moment, then extended her hand. "A bargain, then." His fingers brushed hers, warm, deliberate, brief. A touch that held no impropriety, but more tension than 1,000 declarations. "A bargain," he said. And in that quiet exchange, something was forged, not of romance, not yet, but of respect, of awareness, and of the first stone laid in a path neither had expected to walk. Not alone, not any more. The morning light in Newport carried a different tone in the days leading up to the regatta, brighter, sharper, as though the sky itself had been polished to impress the eyes of guests arriving from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Steamers unloaded trunks, embroidered with monograms, and the city's carriages, newly scrubbed and lacquered, paraded along Bellevue Avenue like horses in a royal procession. From the windows of the Langley estate, the harbour shimmered with anticipation. Flags had begun to appear along the docks, navy blue and white pennants fluttering in the breeze, but within the stone walls of the grand home, an atmosphere of festivity was noticeably absent. Emily Fairfax stood in Beatrice's sitting room, her hands steady as she stacked correspondence into neat piles. The room smelled of pressed violets and ink, of the slow decay of secrets. The escritoire, where Beatrice had once kept her engagement ledger locked beneath a brass key, now stood open and stripped of its authority. A drawer, once used for personal notes, had been quietly emptied. Emily's fingers brushed a sliver of torn ribbon caught in the hinge. It was blue silk, too narrow for a gown trim, too elegant for binding ordinary papers. She picked it up, turned it between her fingers, and slipped it into her pocket. Beatrice had gone quiet again. Since their last evening conversation, she had grown increasingly withdrawn, pale even under rouge, her laughter uncertain, like porcelain under strain. Emily, watching her carefully, understood that this silence was not born of petulance. It was fear, shaped into docility. As Emily finished arranging the letters, Beatrice entered, her fingers fidgeting with the pearls at her throat. Her eyes, so often filled with youthful curiosity, now held something guarded. I need to speak with you," she murmured. Emily motioned gently toward the chair by the window, the one that caught the morning sun. Beatrice sat with practiced grace, then clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I remembered something," she whispered. "The night the ledger went missing. I hadn't told anyone. I wasn't sure it mattered." Emily sat across from her, her voice low and calm. "Go on," Beatrice swallowed. "It was after the musicale. I came upstairs to find my gloves. I'd left them in the salon. When I passed by my room, the door was ajar, and I saw Rupert." Emily did not blink. "Inside?" "Not fully, just standing with his back to the door, looking inside. He shut it quickly when he saw me, smiled and said he thought he heard a cat." "Did you believe him?" Beatrice's lips trembled. "I wanted to. I needed to. But now—" Emily's breath caught with restraint. She rose and walked to the escritoire, her gloved fingertips trailing the edge of the wood. A subtle indentation marked where the ledger once rested. Beatrice had confided that it held not only wedding guest lists and donations, but private notes dictated by her fiancé's mother. Names of political allies, reformers, men and women who had donated quietly to causes the public would never accept. More than society etiquette was at risk. Reputations, marriages, entire alliances could fall with those entries. "I think he took it to sell," Beatrice said quietly, as if voicing the possibility made it real. "Or to trade, for something else." Emily turned to face her. "Or to frame someone else." The words hovered between them. A seagull cried beyond the glass. Beatrice's eyes widened. "Mr. Keaton?" "Possibly," Emily replied, though her voice was gentle. "If Rupert could imply that Bramwell's charitable work is politically motivated, tied to labour unrest, dock strikes, or foreign sympathisers, he could stir suspicion. The timing so close to the regatta would only heighten the impact. But Mr. Keaton has done nothing wrong. In Rupert's hands, even virtue becomes weapon." Beatrice stood and paced toward the mantel, her skirts brushing softly against the parquet floor. "He wouldn't. He couldn't. He's a Langley." Emily said nothing. She let the words rest, let Beatrice hear them echo in her own mind. The truth would settle on her like a cloak, heavy, inevitable. That afternoon, while the house bustled with preparations for a luncheon, Emily walked alone along the southern edge of the estate grounds. She carried a small folio beneath her arm, a bundle of receipts, newspaper clippings, and annotated guest cards she had quietly gathered over the last 2 days. Her destination was not the parlour nor the drawing room, but the Keaton residence 3 blocks away, a quieter home veiled in ivy and guarded by silence. Bramwell received her in a shaded garden terrace overlooking the water. He wore no hat, his dark grey hair touched by the wind, and his vest, though immaculate, showed a subtle crease, as if he had spent more time pacing than sitting. "You've found something," he said before she even spoke. Emily handed him the folio. "These are guest cards from the Langley archives. In the margins are names marked with an asterisk. I compared them to donation ledgers published anonymously by the Morning Courier. The names match, but only the version of the list kept in Beatrice's ledger included yours. Bramwell's jaw tightened. He flipped through the pages with controlled urgency. If Rupert releases these, she continued, he can suggest that your donations weren't acts of kindness, but political maneuvering, that your support of widows and orphans is a front for labor incitement, and the fact that I do business with unions, by necessity, not ideology, won't matter, Bramwell said, because once the idea is planted, truth becomes irrelevant. Emily finished softly. He looked up then, his eyes not hard but sharpened by realization. He's playing a long game. Yes, she answered, and he intends to win. They stood in silence for a moment. The sun filtered through the vines above, casting broken shadows across the stone tiles. I spoke with Beatrice this morning, she added. She saw him outside her room. She didn't want to believe what she saw. But now, she's beginning to, he said. Emily nodded. Bramwell paced once, then stopped beside a wrought-iron chair. There will be consequences. There always are, she replied. His gaze shifted to her, more searching now. You could have remained silent. You could have let this pass. I couldn't. Why? Emily's breath hitched, just for a second. Because I've seen girls like Beatrice destroyed by silence. Because I've seen good men ruined by rumors. Because I've been both. The words fell between them with quiet finality. Bramwell's eyes didn't waver, nor did hers. You've risked more than you should, he said. I know. And still, you came to me. She nodded once. He took a step closer. I am not a man who forgets loyalty, Miss Fairfax, or courage. The breeze shifted. The distance between them was not improper, but it trembled with something close to confession. His hand twitched at his side, as if unsure whether to extend it. Her fingers remained at her waist, still as porcelain. I will not let him ruin me, he said, low and resolute. Emily's voice was softer but equally firm. Nor will I let him ruin her. Their alliance, once tentative, was now a pact sealed by quiet understanding. No signatures, no ink, just truth and the willingness to bear it together. As the city prepared its finest sails and silks for the regatta, beneath the surface of the glitter and the champagne flutes, fractures widened. Not all battles were fought on the water. Some began in shadows, with a stolen ledger, and a name not yet spoken, but already weaponized. The late afternoon sun draped Newport's rugged coastline in molten gold, its warm glow bleeding across the jagged cliffs like spilled honey. The scent of sea salt clung to the breeze, and the rhythmic crash of waves against stone echoed like a distant heartbeat, steady, relentless, ancient. Emily Fairfax walked the narrow path along the cliff's edge with quiet purpose, her skirts gathered in one hand to avoid the grasping bramble that edged the gravel walk. The wind tugged gently at her shawl, pulling wisps of chestnut hair free from the neat coil at the nape of her neck. She wore a dress of pale grey wool, modest and clean, but softened by time and careful mending. In the deep pocket hidden beneath its folds, her gloved fingers wrapped tightly around a folded note. Bramwell Keaton awaited her ahead. He stood near the overlook where the path bent slightly inland, one hand braced against a weathered stone marker, the other tucked behind his back. The breeze swept his coat around his legs like a shadow, resisting his stillness. He did not move when he saw her. He only turned his head slightly, and that was enough. "Miss Fairfax," he said, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "Mr. Keaton," she replied, pausing beside him. The view stretched far and wide, the Atlantic bruised with the approaching dusk, gulls circling high above, and the white sails of pleasure yachts in the distance, catching the last light of day like fading stars. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that weighed nothing and everything all at once. "You chose this place," she said quietly. "It seemed appropriate," he replied. "No one speaks too loudly here." "No, they don't." He looked at her then, and though his expression was composed, his eyes betrayed a flicker of something raw. "You're being whispered about. I know. They think you've overstepped, that you're meddling where you don't belong." Emily gave the smallest, most ironic smile. "I have spent my life not belonging. I've grown rather skilled at it." Bramwell's jaw tightened. His gaze returned to the horizon. "I find it astonishing that people can so easily label others with a single look, a single breath. They think they know. They don't," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "They never do." He turned toward her fully now, stepping closer, the wind catching his coat and sweeping it back like a curtain drawn to reveal the truth. "I lost my wife 6 years ago," he said without preamble. "To a disease no doctor could slow, no wealth could outbid. She died in pain, and I—" He paused, as though the air itself rebelled against what he was about to say. "I became colder, not because I stopped feeling, but because I couldn't afford to feel. I built walls, Miss Fairfax, entire cities of stone inside myself. People say I'm ruthless, that I trade in silence and fear. But what they don't understand is that silence was the only thing I had left after her voice was gone." Emily's eyes shimmered, but she did not look away. "And you believed it safer to remain behind those walls." "I did." A long breath passed between them, and then Emily spoke, her voice low and even, though it seemed to cost her something to do so. "When I lived in London, I served a family not unlike the Langleys. Their daughter, barely 17, was caught exchanging letters with a man beneath her station. Her father intended to dismiss her quietly, send her to relatives in Derbyshire, ruin her name with shame. Bramwell watched her without interruption, but something in his posture softened. "I took the blame," she said simply. "I told them I had intercepted the letters, that I'd failed to report them sooner, that I'd read them, out of curiosity. The scandal shifted to me conveniently, a poor, unmarried companion with no brothers to defend her honor." His eyes darkened. "And they let you fall." "They pushed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I fell with dignity, but I never quite stood again. The sea roared below them, but neither flinched." "You deserve better," he said at last. "I deserve truth," she replied, lifting her chin, "even if it comes alone and without applause." He stepped closer, until the wind between them grew warmer, more intimate. Their eyes locked. His the color of steel under winter sun, hers a dusky gold tinged with fire. "I saw you in the ballroom last night," he murmured, "when they laughed, when they made their barbed remarks in your direction and pretended they were not aimed to wound." Emily's lips pressed together. "I wanted to stand then," he continued, "but I didn't. I waited. I watched. And I realized I've grown far too skilled at silence, even when it no longer protects anyone." "You owe me no defense, Mr. Keaton," she said, though her voice was low, her eyes betraying the thrum beneath her words. "I have weathered worse, but you shouldn't have to." The sincerity in his voice struck her like thunder on glass. She looked away, toward the cliffs, where the water foamed and clawed at the rock below. "You don't know what it means," she said softly, "to live in a world where being seen is the most dangerous thing." "I do," he said. She turned sharply to him. "I know exactly what it means," Bramwell added, "because I've been hiding behind the image they created for me, and you, Miss Fairfax, you saw through it." Emotion welled so fiercely in her chest that she feared it might shatter her if it had space to rise. "You look at me," he whispered, "as if I'm more than what they fear." "And you look at me," she returned, "as if I'm more than what they dismiss." Neither moved, neither dared. The wind quieted, and in that pause, everything changed. That evening, at a formal dinner hosted at the Wellingtons' estate, Emily entered the drawing room with her usual poise, her gown a rich shade of forest green that deepened the glow in her eyes. She moved through the space with quiet grace, neither hurried nor hesitant. The room, buzzing with the friction of society, stilled slightly as she passed. A gentleman laughed too loudly. A woman in brocade whispered behind a fan. "She imagines herself one of us now," someone murmured. Emily heard it. She always did. But this time she lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in choice. When dinner was called and the guests settled into their seats, Bramwell Keaton rose from the far end of the table. His voice was clear, his presence commanding. "Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the presence of Miss Fairfax tonight, a woman of rare intellect and dignity, whose conversation surpasses many I have endured in this very room. Newport is fortunate to have her, as am I." Silence fell like snow. No one laughed, no one dared. Emily, seated across from the hostess, remained still, her cheeks colored faintly, but her gaze never wavered. That night, long after the final course had been cleared and the guests had begun to part beneath the glow of gas lamps and whispered apologies, Emily stepped out onto the terrace alone. The moon hung low and the air was cool on her skin. Her gloved hands rested lightly on the stone railing. And then, footsteps behind her. She did not turn, but she knew. He stood beside her without speaking, the space between them filled not with words, but with something older, deeper, the beginning of longing, the birth of being seen, and in the silence they stayed, together, apart, trembling on the edge of what neither dared name. The regatta ball had arrived with the weight of a coronation. Newport glittered beneath lanterns strung like fallen stars across the gardens of the Whitmore estate. Every stone terrace and silk-draped archway exhaled opulence. Music poured from the windows of the great house like warm honey, and the scent of lilac, salt air, and champagne mingled in the dusk. Society had turned out in full plumage. The wives of senators, the daughters of steel and shipping, the bankers, the barons, the women who ruled behind embroidery and whispers, and in the centre of it all, beneath the grand chandelier of the ballroom, Beatrice Langley stood like a figure carved in porcelain, flawless, hollow, and under siege. Emily Fairfax watched her former pupil from the edge of the crowd, heart thudding in her chest like a bell. Beatrice's gown was ivory silk, her golden hair drawn into a Grecian knot adorned with pearls. But her smile had cracked, and Emily saw it, felt it, the mask slipping. Rupert Langley stood only inches from her, his expression fixed in a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had leaned close, his voice too low for others to hear, his words swallowed by the waltz rising around them. But Emily did not need to hear him. She had seen men like Rupert before, men who draped their cruelty in silk, who played civility like a violin until it bled. Bramwell Keaton stood a few feet to her left, silent as stone. He wore black. Not morning black, but the black of midnight storms, an evening coat tailored within an inch of severity, his cravat fastened with a pin of onyx. His presence, even in stillness, parted the room like a blade. He did not speak. He only watched. And then it happened. Beatrice stepped back from Rupert, her voice sharp enough to cut through the music. "I said no." The word rang like a cracked bell, not shouted but struck. Heads turned. Rupert's face darkened, though he quickly composed himself. His hand remained raised in mid-air, palm open, as if he had expected to take hers once more. Beatrice turned away from him with such force, her pearl comb tumbled from her hair. She looked to Emily, and for the first time that season, the girl no longer looked afraid. Emily moved toward her, but Bramwell was faster. He reached Beatrice's side in 3 long strides and whispered something no one else could hear. Beatrice nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the crowd, her departure like a ship slipping past the harbour's edge, quiet, determined, irreversible. Rupert remained. He straightened his lapel, adjusted his cuffs, and then let his gaze settle on Emily with the precision of a knife. "Well played, Miss Fairfax," he said coldly. "One might think you rehearsed it." Emily's voice was calm. "The truth does not require rehearsal." He stepped closer, too close. You've been filling her head with nonsense, poison. You, with your melancholy and your principles. You've taught her to believe she has a choice. She does. She's a Langley. And you are. She is a person, Emily said, her voice tightening. And I am not afraid of you. He scoffed, smiling, but there was panic behind his teeth. You've made yourself quite the fixture, haven't you? The spinster turned confidant, the orphan whispering in the ears of heirs. She needed someone to tell her she mattered. His mouth curled. And what do you matter, Emily Fairfax? She opened her lips to reply, but the music stopped. And then Bramwell Keaton's voice rang out, clear and low. She matters to me. The room turned. Rupert faltered. How touching. But Bramwell didn't look at him. His gaze was on Emily alone. The crowd parted without being asked, their instincts sharper than any command. A waltz began anew, slow and grand, and Bramwell extended his gloved hand. Miss Fairfax, he said, with the reverence of a promise. May I have this dance? Emily's breath left her like a tide. The ballroom fell silent, but for the strings and the sound of her own pulse. She saw everything, the watching eyes, the barely veiled gasps, the social columns that would write her name in ink before dawn. But more than that, she saw him. Not the shipping magnate, not the widower or the rumoured tyrant. Just a man extending his hand. Her hand slid into his, and the world tilted. They moved together, not as strangers, not as scandal, but as equals. The first turn was slow, measured. His hand was firm at her waist, his other enclosing hers with a precision that felt like shelter. Her breath caught in her throat as they stepped into the second movement, not a stumble, a surrender. Gaslight shimmered on her skin. The scent of rosewater clung to her neckline. His shoulder was warm beneath her fingertips. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. I wanted to. They will talk. They already do. You're risking. He looked down at her then, and she felt the words stop. I have made a life of risk, he said, voice low and steady. But I have never risked my name for something worth protecting. Until now. Their feet glided across the marble, and the air around them held its breath. From the edges of the room, ladies clutched their fans tighter, gentlemen raised eyebrows, conversation stilled. But no one stepped forward. No one dared interrupt. Emily danced, but not in the way she had been taught. She danced like a woman unhidden, like a woman who no longer needed permission to exist. As the waltz built to its final swell, Bramwell's hand pressed more firmly against her back, anchoring her in the storm of stares. She met his gaze, so close, so consuming, and saw not possession, not conquest, but recognition. The music faded. They slowed to stillness. Neither bowed, neither curtsied. They simply stood. And in that stillness, the room began to breathe again, no longer mocking but murmuring. Emily felt the shift. From scandal to fascination, from suspicion to possibility. He released her hand with gentleness. Thank you, he said quietly. She nodded. It was an honor. The crowd returned to its rhythm, but the air remained charged. Bramwell stepped back only enough to allow her space to leave. She did so with her head high, her spine straight, and her heart no longer asleep. In the corridor beyond the ballroom, the sound of the orchestra dimmed. She paused near a carved balustrade, placing one hand upon its smooth surface to steady the thrum in her veins. Behind her, a voice, soft, warm, whispered, You danced as if the room belonged to you. She turned. Beatrice stood there, eyes shining. Emily smiled. For a moment it did, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. Not because society had allowed it, not because anyone had stepped aside to make room, but because she had stepped forward and was seen. The morning after the regatta ball dawned with a deceptive stillness. The waves against the Newport cliffs rolled in calm rhythm. The skies painted in shades of gentle lavender and blue, but beneath the softness of daybreak, the city whispered. Emily Fairfax sat in her modest chamber at the Langley estate, a cup of untouched tea cooling by her side. She held in her hand a folded sheet of parchment. unmarked, save for the neat, slanted script that had made her breath still when she opened it. "Come alone to the Eastern Docks at 9 o'clock tonight, or the truth of your past will find its way to the morning papers. London remembers. So will Newport." There was no name, no signature, but it bore the stench of one man, Rupert Langley. The room around her seemed suddenly small, suffocating. For the first time in many years, fear threaded its way through the fortress she had built inside herself. Not for her reputation, she had already buried that once, but for what such a revelation could cost the fragile balance she had so carefully nurtured in this house, in Beatrice's life, and, though she hardly dared think it, in the eyes of Bramwell Keaton. She folded the note with careful precision and tucked it into the hidden lining of her reticule. By the time she entered the garden, late morning light filtered through rose arches, casting dappled shadows over gravel paths. She found Bramwell near the west hedge, speaking quietly with one of his clerks. His presence had become more frequent on the estate of late, an arrangement that raised brows and fueled speculation, but neither he nor Emily made effort to disguise it. When he dismissed the clerk, he turned to her immediately, as though sensing the unease before she spoke. "You've gone pale," he said, voice low, eyes narrowing. "What's happened?" She looked around, discreetly, but with purpose. Not here. They walked in silence along the path until they reached the stone bench near the fountain, a spot secluded enough to hold secrets. She handed him the note. He read it without a word, then read it again. His jaw flexed. His breath deepened. The air between them thickened with unspoken rage. "When?" he asked. "Tonight. You will not go alone." "I must." "No," he said, rising from the bench. "You must not." She stood too. "If I don't—" "I said no." His voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass. He turned to her, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked entirely undone, not with fear, but with fury. "You've already risked enough for everyone else. Let someone stand for you." Her eyes searched his, and what she saw there made her breath tremble. This was not a man shielding his pride. This was a man who could not bear to let her walk into harm's reach. At 9 o'clock sharp, they stood together beneath the shadow of the docks. The air was damp with fog, thick with the brine of the sea and the scent of coal smoke. Lanterns swung on rusted hooks. In the distance, the clatter of metal and the shouts of night workers echoed off wooden planks and iron hulls. They waited in silence until a figure emerged from behind a stack of crates. Rupert Langley stepped into view, his silhouette sharp against the lantern light. He wore a dark coat tailored for elegance, but reeking of desperation. One hand clutched a leather satchel, the other rested casually on his hip. His smile, when it came, was slow and cruel. "I expected only one," he said, eyeing Bramwell. "You got two," Bramwell answered. "Your arithmetic is slipping." Rupert's eyes flicked to Emily. "You brought a shield. How clever." "I brought a witness," she said evenly. "And an end." He chuckled. "You've always been too proud, Miss Fairfax. But pride doesn't erase what happened in London. The dismissal, the whispers, the letters they found. I wonder what the Courier would make of all that. Or the Times, or the investors so eager to believe Mr. Keaton has been manipulated by a discarded governess with a fondness for revolutionaries." "You underestimate the people you threaten," Emily replied, voice calm as steel, "and overestimate your own immunity." Rupert raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" Bramwell stepped forward, his tone as cold as the air around them. "You have a ledger that doesn't belong to you. You've stolen names, twisted facts, and positioned yourself to profit from their destruction. That's blackmail, Rupert, and you know it." "Do you plan to lecture me on morality, Keaton?" Rupert laughed. "Don't forget, I've seen the ledgers. Your philanthropy is laced with transactions that would bury a lesser man." "Then bury me," Bramwell said, shrugging off his coat and stepping into the full circle of lantern light. "But you won't survive the fall. I've seen the notes you added. False entries, dates that never happened, donations made in the names of dead men. It's all there, your ink, your greed, and your handwriting. Rupert's expression froze. Emily stepped forward now, eyes unwavering. You should have been more careful with your revisions. You left traces, Rupert. You always leave traces. I've read every line, every name, every sum. You didn't think I would know how to read the language of finance. You mistook silence for ignorance. You're bluffing, Rupert growled. Then let us test it, Bramwell said, pulling a folded envelope from his inner coat pocket. This is a notarized transcript of the original ledger, documented by a solicitor as soon as it was recovered. It names you. It exposes you. Rupert's hand tightened around the satchel. You ruin me, he hissed, and you ruin yourselves. No one will believe the two of you came out of this clean. We don't need to be clean, Emily said softly. We only need to be true. A long pause followed. The fog shifted. A bell rang somewhere beyond the docks. Rupert exhaled sharply, then threw the satchel at Bramwell's feet. Take it. You've won this round. Emily didn't flinch. Then don't threaten another. Rupert stepped back into the fog, but not before turning his gaze on her one last time. You're clever, Miss Fairfax, he said. But cleverness has its price. She met his eyes. So does cowardice. And with that, he vanished into the mist. Bramwell retrieved the satchel, opened it briefly and confirmed the contents. He handed it to Emily without speaking. She took it with both hands, her gloves trembling slightly. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded, though her throat burned. I will be. He touched her elbow lightly. You were magnificent. Her breath hitched. I was terrified. And yet you stood. Their eyes locked. No one else in the world, just them, on the edge of scandal, on the edge of something deeper. He didn't touch her further. He didn't need to. But as they turned from the docks and began walking toward the awaiting carriage side by side, Emily felt something shift, not in the ledger or in society's perception, but in the space between their hands. A promise had been made that night, quiet, unspoken, but irrevocable. The storm did not arrive with thunder or wind, but with a single headline. It appeared the next morning on the front page of the Newport Courier, nestled between gossip about the regatta and a feature on French lace trends. The title was unassuming, misplaced trust and misguided charity, but the ink bled like a wound. The article named no names, not directly, but it didn't need to. It spoke of a certain shipping magnate whose generosity was a veil for radical sympathies, and a lady companion whose questionable past in London society had followed her across the sea. It included excerpts from a ledger, falsified, altered, but real enough to strike. By mid-morning, society was in a frenzy. The drawing rooms of Bellevue Avenue filled with whispers sharp enough to draw blood. Names were spoken behind fans, glances were exchanged over crystal goblets, and every syllable that slipped between painted lips was shaped to wound. At the Langley estate, silence reigned. Emily Fairfax stood in the small writing room adjoining her chamber, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the Courier and laid it flat upon the desk. Outside, the garden buzzed with bees and colour, oblivious to the collapse taking place inside the house. There had been no formal accusation, no letter of dismissal, but the air had shifted. Doors now closed with more care when she passed. Footmen averted their eyes. Conversations ceased the moment her footsteps approached. Even the household cat, once so fond of curling at her ankles, had grown skittish with the mood of the humans who fed it. She heard the faint knock on her chamber door. It was Mrs. Alcott. The housekeeper entered with her usual dignity, though her eyes were tired. She looked at Emily and then, without a word, held out a worn envelope. Emily took it carefully. Inside was her own letter of resignation. She had written it the night before, half-finished, unsent. The paper had been in her drawer. "I knew you'd never deliver it yourself," Mrs. Alcott said softly. "So I thought I'd bring it, in case you still mean to go." Emily sat slowly, the weight of the moment crashing through her chest. "I suppose there's little choice left," she said, barely above a whisper. "I won't ask Mr. Keaton to defend what can no longer be defended." Not in a world that demands silence from the wrong people and penance from the innocent. Mrs. Alcott stepped forward, her eyes brimming. Before you go, there's something you should know. Emily looked up. You never told Beatrice the truth about London, the housekeeper said. But I knew. I've known all along. Emily's eyes widened. Mrs. Alcott sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap. Years ago, before you came to us, I visited your former household. I knew someone on staff, a cousin who wrote to me. She told me everything, that the theft was committed by the lady of the house, that she intended to frame the maid, and that you took the blame so the girl wouldn't be sent to prison. The Langley name was involved, distant, but enough to make it a scandal. Emily's throat tightened. Why didn't you ever say? Because it wasn't my secret to tell, Mrs. Alcott said. But it's time it was no longer yours to carry alone. The housekeeper stood, smoothing her apron. I'll see to your trunk. But before she could leave, Emily grasped her hand. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Mrs. Alcott replied. Thank the woman you've always been, the one we were all too blind to see. By evening, Emily had packed her belongings. She left no note for Bramwell. What could she write that would not feel like a plea? Her name, now bruised and weighted with suspicion, could not live beside his, not without dragging him under. She passed through the hallways of the house as if in a dream, her steps soft upon the rugs, her eyes dry not from strength, but from exhaustion. At the base of the stairs, she paused for a final glance. The portraits lining the corridor stared back at her, paintings of Langley brides and barons, of ancestors whose honour had been inherited, not earned. She walked out without a sound, but elsewhere, that very afternoon, another room stirred. A luncheon of social consequence was being held at the Whitmore estate, hosted by a duchess's cousin and attended by women whose words shaped the fate of marriages and reputations alike. The subject of Emily Fairfax, naturally, had taken the centre of attention. Whispers clung to champagne glasses, laughter masked cruelty. She came from nothing, a matron murmured. No blood, no fortune, and yet she walked as if invited. Well, a younger woman replied, now she knows her place. The conversation turned, cruel and easy, until Beatrice Langley rose from her chair. She was dressed in rose silk, her expression serene, but her voice, when it came, carried across the table like thunder wrapped in velvet. You speak of Miss Fairfax as if she were a story written by strangers, she said. Allow me to correct the narrative. A hush fell. She protected my family once, at her own expense, Beatrice continued. She took the blame for an act she didn't commit, to protect someone bearing the Langley name. She could have told the truth. She could have ruined us. But she chose silence, dignity. Several women gasped softly. Beatrice looked around the table. You call her ambitious, but she asked for nothing. You call her calculating, but she spent her life helping others from the shadows. And I would not be the woman I am today had it not been for her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high. If the name Langley still carries any weight, it is because she carried it when it was too heavy for the rest of us. No one spoke. The Duchess's cousin blinked, and slowly another lady at the table nodded, then another. In the days that followed, word of Beatrice's declaration rippled through Newport like a change in tide. The same mouths that had whispered against Emily now hesitated. The same eyes that had narrowed in judgment now widened in reconsideration. The scales had shifted, not entirely, not forever, but enough. And as for Bramwell Keaton, he stood in his study that night, her letter unopened in his hand, the finality of her departure pressing into his chest like a vice. He had lost contracts before, ships, fortunes, but this loss felt personal, irreversible, and it left him not empty, but waiting for a choice that was no longer his alone to make. The sea rolled beneath the morning mist like a creature at rest, vast, breathing, unknowable. The scent of brine and salt weed lingered in the air, weaving through the cypress trees that lined the narrow path to the chapel. It was a small, time-worn structure built of weather-softened stone, nestled atop a bluff that overlooked the grey Atlantic like a silent sentinel. Few came here now. The Langley family had long since stopped attending services at this coastal retreat, its pews abandoned to seagulls and wind whispers. But Emily Fairfax sat alone beneath its arched beams. She had left no trace of where she had gone. No note, no messenger. Only Mrs. Alcott might have guessed, and if she had said nothing. Emily needed a place not simply to think, but to end. To lay down the part of herself that had fought, endured, risen, fallen. And perhaps, if the silence allowed it, to mourn. She sat on the last pew, hands folded around a letter whose edges had been smoothed so many times they no longer curled. Her gloves rested beside her. Her hat had been removed. There was no pretense here, no audience to please or defy. Only a woman, 40 years of age, who had loved without permission and lost without ceremony. The creak of the door startled her. She turned. There he stood. Bramwell Keaton did not fill the doorway as others might. He did not thunder forward with dramatic declarations or come cloaked in righteous fury. Instead, he stepped in quietly, as if the wind itself had delivered him. His overcoat was damp from fog. A curl of hair, usually so precisely combed, had fallen across his brow. His eyes met hers with a gravity that said all storms had passed through him before this one, and still he had come. Emily rose. "How did you find me?" "I listened to where the tide was loudest," he said softly. Her throat constricted. "You shouldn't be here." "I disagree." She pressed the letter into his hands. "Then take this. Read it, and leave." He didn't move, didn't unfold the paper. His gaze lowered to the envelope and then returned to her face. "I don't need to read it," he said. "Please," she whispered. "It says what I could never say aloud." "Then say it now." Emily shook her head. "You don't understand what they've done, what I have done, the accusations, the shame. I cannot be a weight around your neck, Bramwell. I cannot stand beside you only to be the reason others look away." He studied her, the silence between them thick as velvet. "I came here to give you this letter," she continued, "because I thought I could survive letting you go if I did it with dignity. But I can't do this dance anymore, where one glance becomes a sin, where one kindness becomes a scandal. I love you, and that love has ruined everything I tried to protect." For a long moment neither moved. Then, without a word, Bramwell tore the letter clean down the middle. The sound echoed through the chapel like thunder in a tomb. Emily's breath caught. "What are you doing?" "Writing my answer." He let the pieces fall at his feet, then crossed the aisle with deliberate steps. "I am not offering you shelter from judgment, nor am I asking for your silence or your sacrifice. What I am asking, what I am, is a man who no longer wants to be alone with the weight of reputation." She stared at him. "I don't want to possess you, Emily," he said, voice low. "I want to walk beside you, to build something that answers to neither pity nor pride." Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. "You're asking me for what? Not marriage, not security." "No," he said, "not a proposal in the traditional sense, a partnership. In truth, in purpose, in rebellion, if need be." Her heart beat like cathedral bells inside her chest. "And if I say yes, then we return as equals. Not spectacle, not charity. You will not hide behind my name, and I will not ask you to." She stared at him, trembling from the force of the offer. And then she nodded, slowly, firmly. "One condition." He raised a brow. "Our lives, our days together, must be built on truth. No locked doors, no noble lies for each other's sake. If the world should wound us again, I would rather bleed beside you than pretend we are untouched." His smile was not wide, it was quiet, resolute, and devastating. "Then let us begin." He extended his hand, and for the first time she took it without hesitation. They stepped into the salt-laced light of morning, out of the stone shell of yesterday's ghosts. The path back to Newport waited, winding and unknown, but she no longer feared being seen, no longer flinched at the idea of belonging to something, someone, somewhere again. They did not speak as they walked. They did not need to. The world would say what it wished. The whispers would start anew. But when Bramwell glanced down at her hand in his, he did not see scandal or salvage. He saw the woman who had faced ruin for others, who had spoken with gentleness even when surrounded by cruelty, who had dared to dream beyond the cage society had named too old. And when Emily looked up at him, at this man who had buried grief beneath empire and now stood vulnerable in the morning fog, she did not see a prize. She saw a companion. And in that seeing, they began. The last days of August settled over Newport like a golden veil, softening the edges of the marble mansions and turning the sea into a mirror of light. The season's end brought a kind of hush, an exhalation after the excess. As parasols were folded, invitations ceased to arrive with urgency, and society's most fastidious ladies prepared to return to their city salons. Yet in that lingering stillness, something had shifted, quietly but irrevocably. Emily Fairfax stood beside Bramwell Keaton on the veranda of the Langley estate, the place that once confined her now a witness to her transformation. The sea breeze tugged at the silk ribbons of her bonnet, and her gloved hand rested gently on his arm, as though the gesture had always belonged to her. Below them, preparations bustled for the season's final luncheon, a gathering of influence disguised as a farewell. White tents billowed on the lawn. A string quartet tuned their instruments beneath a pergola of climbing roses. Footmen moved like chess pieces, aligning silver and crystal, unaware that the true center of the gathering had already shifted. Beatrice Langley arrived on horseback, her cheeks flushed with the boldness of her choice. She wore no diamonds that day, only a cameo pinned to her sash, once belonging to her mother, now worn not as ornament, but declaration. At her side rode Nathaniel Barrett, the man she had chosen freely, a schoolmaster's son, a scholar of ethics, a gentleman without title. The engagement, announced only days prior, had shocked the remaining social circles still clinging to expectation, but Beatrice had no need to explain. She dismounted without help, waved to the guests with regal composure, and made her way toward Emily. "Miss Fairfax," she said with a curtsy full of warmth, "will you sit beside me?" Emily nodded. They had crossed a long road together, first as tutor and student, then as protector and confessor, and finally as two women learning to defy what others had written for them. Today, their bond was no longer concealed beneath social veneer. As they walked arm in arm toward the garden, Bramwell observed them with a quiet smile, one hand tucked behind his back. Emily felt the weight of his gaze, never possessive, never demanding, merely present, steady. Rupert Langley, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Whispers suggested he had fled Newport 2 mornings prior under the guise of a business opportunity in Chicago. Others said he had boarded a night train to Philadelphia with only a valise and a bitter mouthful of defeat. The truth hardly mattered. What remained was silence. His allies had distanced themselves, his shares had plummeted, and the echoes of his falsehoods now clung to him like the scent of smoke on damask. Inside the luncheon tent, society's most practiced tongues flickered like candle flames, low and watchful. Emily felt them on her skin, on her posture, on her name. But she no longer curled beneath them. She stood as she always had, spine straight, eyes level, grace unmarred. "Is it true," whispered a lady in lilac lace as Emily passed, "that he still sees her every morning? She's living with him, they say, openly, and he hasn't offered her marriage. He's ruined. She's nothing but a governess with delusions." Emily heard none of it, or rather, she let it move past her like mist. The only voice she registered was Bramwell's, low and amused at her side. "They will talk until their tongues fall out," he said, offering her a glass of lemonade. "And what will we do until then?" she asked. He leaned in, just enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath beneath her ear. Live. Later that afternoon, they strolled the harbour as the sun dipped low, brushing the horizon with streaks of copper and wine. Children ran barefoot along the dock, chasing gulls. Old fishermen mended nets. A fiddler played near the fish market, his bow moving like a memory across the strings. They walked slowly, Bramwell's arm curved protectively, yet effortlessly, around hers. It was a pose once scandalous, now undeniable. It was then that a dowager seated on a bench, shaded by a parasol trimmed in morning black, leaned toward her companion and spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry. "She's too old for fairy tales." The words fell like coins in a fountain, meant to stir the air, not the soul. But Emily heard them, and she waited. Would he bristle? Would he defend her? But Bramwell only paused. He turned to Emily, and he looked at her. The gaze was unhurried, unguarded, so full of certainty that the air seemed to still around them. There was no apology in his eyes, no pity, no indulgence, only pride, the kind that had nothing to prove and everything to offer. He looked at her as a man looks when he has built his house, survived a storm, and found a flame still burning at the hearth. And in that gaze, Emily felt it. Not invisibility, not tolerance, but being chosen, freely, deliberately, completely. She smiled, not coyly, not in triumph, but in understanding, because she knew now that fairy tales were not reserved for the young or the untouched. They were earned, built, fought for. And this love, theirs, was not the bloom of spring, but the strength of late summer, full of heat, resilience, and ripeness. As the harbour bells rang out the hour, Bramwell offered her his hand once more. "Shall we go home?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Let's begin." And they did. Not as whispers behind curtains, not as relics of what might have been, but as architects of a future neither had dared to believe possible. Where truth was the foundation, where tenderness had teeth, and where a woman who had once been overlooked became unforgettable, because someone had seen her fully and never looked away. The sound of gulls still danced over Newport's cliffs, but time had worn their cries into something softer, less wild, more familiar. The sea remained as it ever was, brushing the shore with ancient rhythm, but the people who once walked its harbour had changed. On a sun-warmed morning in late August, the estate once known as Langley House had shed its old name. The wrought-iron gate now bore a modest plaque, the Fairfax Centre for Women's Learning. Carriages came not for dances, but for lectures. Girls in straw bonnets carried books instead of lace fans. And in the library, sunlight spilled across rows of shelves, bearing the names of women who had once been footnotes. Now, they were the curriculum. Emily Fairfax stood in the rose garden, her hands lightly dusted with soil. She had just shown a group of students how to propagate cuttings from the heirloom roses she had planted her first spring here. Their petals bloomed deeper now than when they'd first taken root, like her own life. She was 45 now. Her hair, once a chestnut veil pinned tightly in place, was streaked with silver she never thought to hide. Her hands bore the elegant calluses of use, chalk, books, letters, and love. A familiar step approached behind her, deliberate yet unhurried. "Are you recruiting scholars or digging for gold?" Bramwell's voice teased, warm as the mid-morning sun. Emily turned, brushing her hands on her apron. "Some days, it's the same thing." He kissed her cheek. Still, always. Bramwell Keaton had changed in ways the world hadn't expected. His empire had not fallen, but it had shifted. He stepped down from the board of his shipping line 3 years prior and devoted his wealth to infrastructure and coastal preservation. His name, once synonymous with steel and scandal, was now found in clean water projects and widows' pensions. They never married. It confused some, infuriated others. But they had chosen instead to legalize their partnership through a trust and public declaration. drafted on the steps of City Hall. "We did not marry," Emily once told a journalist. "We allied." And yet, in every room they entered, the gravity between them silenced doubt. Beatrice Langley, now Beatrice Barrett, arrived that afternoon with her twin daughters, wild-limbed girls who asked endless questions and ran with muddy boots across the stone paths. She laughed louder these days, her spirit intact and never traded for anyone's title. Nathaniel Barrett had taken a professorship in Providence, and Beatrice oversaw a small press devoted to women's voices in literature and political thought. Rupert Langley had not fared as well. After a brief resurgence in Baltimore, his name vanished from financial pages. He died 2 years ago in Vienna, alone. No obituaries adorned society columns, no mourners spoke of him. The price of his ambition had been relevance, its cost, connection. At twilight, Emily and Bramwell walked the familiar cliffside path, now less a confession ground and more a sacred ritual. The wind was cooler, the path more worn, but each time their hands found each other, something inside them steadied. "We were foolish," she said once as they looked over the sea. "To love?" he asked. "To think it had passed us by?" He smiled without turning. It never had. It only waited until we had the courage to recognize it. Below them, the sea sighed against the rocks. Above them, the stars waited for their hour. And within them, love lived. Not as fire, nor as fantasy, but as a lighthouse, unwavering, earned, and necessary. Their story did not end with declarations or rings or applause. It endured. In the lessons taught beneath oak trees, in the steady reform of old institutions, in the quiet strength of a woman who was once called too old for fairy tales, and who became the author of her own legend, and in the way he still looked at her, 5 summers later, as though the world had just begun. What a journey, dear listener. Emily's story reminds us that it is never too late, for dignity, for truth, for love. Too often the world tells women that their worth diminishes with time, that their value fades when youth slips away. But here, we witnessed something far more powerful. A woman who rose, not because she was young or desired, but because she knew who she was and chose to be seen. Through betrayal, whispers, injustice, and fear, Emily Fairfax walked with quiet courage. And in the end, she was not rescued nor redeemed by someone else's name. She was chosen, fully and freely, for the woman she had become. Let this story be a gentle flame in your heart, a reminder that strength often looks like stillness, that love is not measured in age or status, but in mutual truth, and that sometimes the fairy tale doesn't arrive when we expect it, but when we are finally ready to believe we deserve one. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect or stirred something within, I invite you to leave a comment below. Tell us what Emily's journey meant to you, and if you made it to the end, write the word "seen," because that is the quiet victory Emily carried, and perhaps so do you. If you wish to support the team behind these historical love stories, you can send a super thanks here on YouTube with whatever amount feels right to you. It helps us continue to bring you these timeless tales, created with care and passion. And if that's not possible for you right now, simply sharing this story with a friend or loved one is a gift in itself. Your support, your presence, means everything. And if you're longing for more unforgettable love stories, be sure to check out the other romantic narratives I've left for you in the cards. Each one is a world waiting to be opened. Thank you for listening. And remember, it is never too late to be seen.